The roar of the engine tore through the sky, a metallic scream that cut through the morning haze above northern France. A lone P-51 Mustang, gleaming in the first light of dawn, twisted and turned in ways that seemed almost impossible. Its pilot, eyes narrowed against the glare, pulled the controls sharply, flipping the aircraft upside down, diving through a hailstorm of tracer rounds from enemy fighters. Each maneuver was a defiance of expectation, a dance on the razor's edge between life and death. Yet, from the ground and the air alike, those watching could only gasp and wonder, how was this machine capable of such feats? And why had the Americans begun flying upside down in combat, an act that once seemed sheer madness? It was the spring of 1944, and the skies over Europe were a theater of relentless conflict. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, every inch of airspace was contested, every moment measured in fractions of a second. German Luftwaffe pilots, trained, disciplined, and armed with deadly aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, had once laughed at the idea of unescorted American bombers crossing their skies. The P-51 Mustangs newly arrived were not yet feared. They were anomalies, fast but untested, agile but seemingly ordinary in a sky dominated by seasoned German aces. And yet somewhere in a secret hangar, German engineers and test pilots had captured one of these Mustangs. They sat in the cockpit, hands gripping unfamiliar controls, hearts racing not from the rush of combat, but from awe. For the first time, they flew the aircraft themselves and admitted almost with disbelief that they had never encountered anything like it. The Mustang was no mere fighter. It was a revelation. Its handling was precise, intuitive, almost alive in the hands of a skilled pilot. Rolls, dives, abrupt reversals, maneuvers that would have stressed other planes to the breaking point, were effortless in its design. The Luftwaffe, proud and unyielding, faced a new reality. The rules of engagement they had mastered for years no longer applied. This was not just a test of metal and mechanics. It was a test of ingenuity and courage. The Americans, aware of their enemy's growing skill and adaptability, began experimenting with tactics that defied convention. Upside-down flying in combat, treetop-level attacks, deceptive feints, all were strategies born not of recklessness, but necessity. Pilots risked their lives, twisting and turning in ways that seemed almost suicidal, to gain an edge against opponents who had once believed the sky belonged to them. Each maneuver was a gamble, each sortie a question posed to fate. Who would learn faster, adapt better, survive longer? The intrigue lay not only in the aircraft, but in the men who flew them, who first dared to defy gravity, to trust an untested tactic that made the difference between life and death. How did a captured aircraft, examined behind enemy lines, illuminate weaknesses that had gone unnoticed? And how did those insights ripple through the strategies of both sides? And finally, the burning question that hovered over every cloud, every dogfight, every daring maneuver. Could a single innovation, a single act of courage, truly alter the course of the war? As the Mustang executed another impossible twist in the sky, German pilots watching from below could only shake their heads in disbelief. Here was a fighter that seemed to have a mind of its own, responding to every input with uncanny precision. The Americans had discovered something extraordinary, a machine that turned conventional wisdom on its head, a fighter that demanded new thinking, new courage, new audacity. And as the clouds parted to reveal the distant horizon, one fact became painfully clear. The balance of air power was shifting, and no one would ever see aerial combat the same way again. In the shadow of this revelation, the story unfolds. A story of innovation under fire, of pilots who tested limits, of engineers whose curiosity challenged entire doctrines. And at the heart of it all, a question that would haunt the skies for the rest of the war. Why did this Mustang, a captured aircraft flown by the enemy themselves, leave even seasoned German pilots stunned? And what would it take for the Allies to fully unleash its potential? By the early 1940s, the skies over Europe had become a deadly chessboard. The Luftwaffe dominated the air, its fighters and aces a seemingly insurmountable wall above the battlefields. Messerschmitt Bf-109s streaked across the clouds with lethal precision, their nimble frames slicing through Allied formations. Focke-Wulf FW-190s, with their rugged power, tore apart any aircraft that ventured too close. To face them, American pilots initially relied on numbers, escorting heavy bombers in long, grueling formations, hoping sheer mass would deter attacks. Yet the reality was harsh. The Luftwaffe's experience, speed, and tactical cunning inflicted devastating losses. The early encounters revealed the limitations of American aircraft. P-38 Lightnings were fast but heavy, unwieldy at low altitudes. P-40 Warhawks were sturdy, but lacked the maneuverability to outturn a Japanese Zero in the Pacific or a Bf-109 in Europe. In the European theater, Mustang prototypes had begun arriving, but the first models, equipped with Allison engines, excelled only at low altitude. American pilots had to adapt, often improvising in the air, attempting maneuvers that were born of desperation as much as skill. Dogfights were brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. Survival depended on split-second decisions, and the cost of misjudgment was death. Amidst this pressure, a few innovative pilots and engineers began questioning the orthodox tactics. Colonel William Wild Bill Sherman, an ace in his own right, advocated for aggressive yet unconventional maneuvers, experimenting with steep dives and rapid altitude changes to exploit the weaknesses of enemy aircraft. On the other side, German engineers, like Hans Joachim Marseille's adversaries, meticulously studied the formations of American bombers, attempting to predict their moves and counter with precise, lethal efficiency. Every sortie was both a lesson and a warning. The battlefield was evolving, and any pilot unwilling to evolve with it risked annihilation. It was in this crucible of innovation and desperation that the P-51 Mustang truly began to shine. Equipped with the new Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could climb, dive, and maneuver at speeds that rivaled anything the Luftwaffe had deployed. Its range allowed long, unescorted missions deep into enemy territory, challenging the previously unassailable German air superiority. Pilots who mastered its capabilities discovered a machine that responded almost intuitively to every input, a combination of power, speed, and agility that demanded respect. Air combat was no longer just about flying straight and hoping to outgun the opponent. It became a ballet of precision, strategy, and daring. The initial skepticism among commanders gradually gave way to recognition. Tactical briefings shifted from standard formations to discussions of individual initiative, of pushing aircraft to limits previously deemed impossible. Engineers analyzed performance data, not just to improve hardware, but to understand how pilots could exploit subtle advantages in maneuverability. The sky became a laboratory and every dogfight a test of theory and instinct. Key figures emerged. Major George Preddy, known for his fearless attacks and innovative approaches. Colonel John D. Landers, advocating for low-level strafing runs that defied conventional safety protocols. And numerous unsung pilots whose ingenuity in the cockpit would later shape the doctrine of aerial combat. Even as the Allies began exploiting the Mustang's potential, the Germans were not idle. Intelligence units scoured reports, interrogated captured pilots, and analyzed wreckage to understand this new threat. It was one thing to face a standard P-51 in combat. It was another to grasp its full capabilities. The Luftwaffe's initial laughter at unescorted bombers quickly turned to cautious concern as they witnessed Mustangs performing maneuvers that seemed to defy known aerodynamics. Rumors spread among German squadrons that the Americans were developing tactics that no textbook had ever described, maneuvers that, if perfected, could tip the scales in a war that had already consumed millions of lives. The backdrop of these developments was not abstract, it was visceral. Airfields littered with burned wrecks, the smell of fuel and gunpowder, the cries of pilots struggling to survive. It was in this environment that the seeds of innovation were sown. Each new encounter pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. By the time a captured Mustang found its way into a German hangar, the stage was set. Both sides had glimpsed a new reality of air combat, a reality that required audacity, imagination, and an unflinching willingness to defy convention. And so the context was clear. The battle in the skies was no longer just a contest of numbers or firepower. It was a struggle of wits, of daring, and of the courage to embrace the unknown. The Mustang, with its sleek lines and hidden potential, was poised to become the instrument through which this transformation would occur. What remained to be seen was how pilots, both Allied and Axis, would adapt to its presence, and what extraordinary risks they would take to master the skies in a war where innovation was often the only difference between life and death. By the summer of 1944, the air over Europe had grown increasingly merciless. The skies, once dominated by confidence and routine, now echoed with the chaos of failed missions and shattered formations. American pilots, despite the arrival of the new P-51 Mustangs, were still grappling with the brutal reality that the Luftwaffe was adapting faster than anticipated. Each engagement became a test not only of skill but of nerve, and for many, survival hung by a thread thinner than a wing spar. The cost was devastating. On June 12th, over the skies of northern France, a formation of Mustangs escorting B-17 bombers was ambushed by seasoned German pilots flying FW-190s. Major Robert Johnson, a rising star among the 357th Fighter Group, dove aggressively to protect a straggling bomber. In moments, tracer fire laced the air, ripping through wings and fuselage. Two of Johnson's comrades went down within minutes. The air was thick with smoke, the screams of damaged engines blending with the roar of gunfire. Miraculously, Johnson survived, but the lesson was clear. The old tactics, those drilled into pilots since their training days, were no longer sufficient. It was not only the ferocity of the enemy that created crisis, it was the failure of doctrine. Standard maneuvers, formation flying, and predictable strafing runs were being met with cunning counters. Luftwaffe pilots exploited weaknesses Americans had not yet understood. Tight vertical turns, coordinated pincer attacks, and the ruthless efficiency of experienced aces like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer and Erich Hartmann. Pilots reported feeling trapped in the sky, as if every move had already been anticipated. Frustration and fear settled over the squadrons like a cold fog. Some men began questioning not just tactics, but survival itself. Psychological pressure mounted. The young pilots, many barely out of their teens, carried the weight of entire missions on their shoulders. Flight logs became grim testaments to the limits of human endurance. One pilot, after a disastrous encounter over the Rhineland, described the sensation of watching two wingmen spiral down in flames, unable to assist, unable to retreat. Commanders convened in tense meetings, analyzing reports with a sense of growing dread. Standard strategies were failing, losses were mounting, and the Luftwaffe seemed impervious to conventional attacks. Innovation, however, was never born in comfort. The crisis demanded it. In the 4th Fighter Group, discussions turned from abstract theory to desperate experimentation. Pilots and engineers debated the possibility of turning the aircraft's newfound capabilities to advantage. Could maneuvers once considered suicidal, diving inverted, attacking from unexpected angles, exploiting the Mustang's agility, provide the edge necessary to survive? Whispers circulated among airmen. Someone had to attempt what others would not dare. Each conversation carried tension. Each proposal risked ridicule or death. Yet the need was undeniable: adapt or perish. Several missions highlighted the urgent necessity of change. On one fateful afternoon, near Aachen, a squadron of P-51s attempted to intercept a formation of Bf-109s. Standard engagement procedures failed catastrophically. Pilots found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn, forced into sharp dives that pushed structural limits. Engines roared, wings flexed, and adrenaline surged. Some attempted evasive roles, improvising on instinct. One young lieutenant later recounted that it felt like dancing on a knife's edge. One miscalculation, and the air would claim them. The outcome? 4 aircraft lost, dozens more damaged, morale shaken. The existing doctrines had reached a dead end. From the ground up, the realization dawned: survival and victory depended on rethinking everything. The Mustang was more than a machine. It was an opportunity, a vessel for tactics that defied conventional wisdom. But translating potential into practice required courage few had yet summoned. Who would first attempt the impossible? Who would risk upside-down maneuvers over enemy lines, banking on intuition, skill, and a fragile aircraft to carry them through? These questions hung over the pilots like storm clouds, pressing against the limits of imagination and bravery. Amid the crisis, the Germans were observing as well. Reports from captured American pilots, along with intelligence on the new Mustangs, suggested that the Allies were reaching a breaking point. The Luftwaffe anticipated bold, perhaps reckless, strategies. But could they foresee the radical maneuvers that were about to redefine aerial warfare? The tension was not just tactical. It was existential. The war in the sky was no longer about repeating tried and tested maneuvers. It was about embracing uncertainty, defying logic, and daring to fly where no pilot had dared before. In this crucible of failure and frustration, the seeds of innovation were sown. The dead ends and losses forced pilots to look beyond doctrine, to challenge both fear and expectation. Somewhere in the ranks, someone would rise, someone would test the limits of the Mustang in ways that would astonish friend and foe alike. The crisis, with all its despair and danger, was the prelude to a breakthrough, a revolution in tactics, that would forever change the skies over Europe. And with that realization came the stirring of hope, the spark that would ignite audacity into action, leading to maneuvers that would leave German pilots both astonished and wary of the unassuming Mustang. The air was electric with tension the day it happened. Clouds hung low over the French countryside, and the hum of engines filled the sky with a persistent, nerve-tingling rhythm. For months, American pilots had struggled, testing every conventional tactic against a Luftwaffe that seemed always one step ahead. Losses mounted, strategies faltered, and the specter of defeat loomed. Yet in that crucible of desperation, one pilot dared to attempt the impossible. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Halsey of the 357th Fighter Group had watched too many comrades fall. He knew instinctively that conventional maneuvers, tight turns, formation flying, predictable dive attacks, would not suffice. The Mustang in his hands was responsive, almost intuitively alive, capable of twists and rolls that other aircraft could not endure. And so, in a split-second decision born of both courage and necessity, Halsey rolled his Mustang inverted and dived, racing through a hailstorm of tracer fire as if gravity itself had lost its authority. The results were staggering. Enemy fighters, trained to anticipate predictable maneuvers, found themselves confused and disoriented. For a moment, the sky became a playground of audacity. Halsey executed loops and rolls that seemed to defy both physics and expectation. His comrades, inspired and astonished, began attempting variations of the maneuver, experimenting with inverted dives and sudden altitude shifts. What had once seemed sheer madness was proving terrifyingly effective. The tactic was raw, untested, and dangerous, but it worked. Word of the new maneuver spread quickly through the ranks. Flight briefings, once rigid and formulaic, became forums for experimentation. Pilots discussed angles of attack, optimal altitudes, and timing for inverted dives. Engineers analyzed stress loads and control responses, refining approaches to minimize risk while maximizing advantage. The P-51 Mustang, already a marvel of engineering, had become the instrument of a tactical revolution. Yet the breakthrough was not without skepticism. Some commanders balked at what appeared to be reckless acrobatics, fearing losses that could outweigh gains. Upside-down flying in combat, they muttered, incredulous. It's suicide. Others, however, recognized the potential immediately. Tactical officers, after observing successful sorties, began advocating for broader adoption, realizing that the maneuver leveraged the Mustang's unique capabilities to exploit enemy weaknesses. It was audacity shaped into strategy. The first widely reported success came during an escort mission over the Ruhr Valley. Halsey, now joined by two other pilots attempting inverted approaches, engaged a squadron of FW-190s. Enemy formations, trained for standard intercepts, were caught off guard. The upside-down dives allowed the Mustangs to attack from angles the Germans had not anticipated, disrupting formations and creating openings for bombers to pass unscathed. The Luftwaffe pilots later admitted that the maneuvers were unlike anything they had ever encountered. The aircraft seemed to twist and respond with a precision that human hands alone could not produce. A captured Mustang flown by German test pilots would later confirm their astonishment. "We had never seen handling like this," they would write in reports. The aircraft was, in every sense, revolutionary. The breakthrough transformed not only tactics, but morale. American pilots, emboldened by the success, began to experiment further. Low-level strafing runs, deceptive feints, and synchronized inverted dives became part of a growing repertoire of maneuvers designed to confuse and dominate. Each engagement tested limits, both of the pilot's skill and of the aircraft's engineering, but with every successful sortie, confidence grew. The Mustang was no longer just an escort fighter. It was a tactical instrument capable of reshaping the battlefield. The Germans, meanwhile, were forced into a grudging reassessment. Intelligence reports described these new maneuvers in precise detail, cataloging the inverted dives and sudden reversals that had shattered formations and destroyed aircraft. Test pilots who had flown captured Mustangs marveled at the machine's responsiveness and handling. The Luftwaffe realized that their previous assumptions about air superiority were no longer valid. The Americans had introduced a variable they could not yet counter: creativity, audacity, and the willingness to exploit the Mustang's capabilities in ways that defied all precedent. In the months that followed, the tactic evolved. Manuals incorporated guidelines for inverted approaches. Instructors emphasized improvisation within a framework of controlled risk. Squadrons shared insights from combat to refine timing and execution. The breakthrough had transcended a single pilot's daring act. It had become doctrine. From a desperate experiment born of crisis, a new chapter in aerial warfare had been written. And above the clouds, amid the roar of engines and the tracers streaking like silver threads, a profound truth emerged. Innovation, when paired with courage, could rewrite the rules of combat entirely. The skies over Europe were never the same again. Once a theater dominated by rigid doctrines and predictable maneuvers, aerial combat had been transformed by audacity, innovation, and the unparalleled capabilities of the P-51 Mustang. What began as a desperate experiment with inverted dives and unconventional approaches now rippled across the Allied air forces, producing tangible results that shifted the balance of power in the air. Victory came first in measurable terms. Escorts of B-17 and B-24 bombers, once vulnerable to concentrated Luftwaffe attacks, now had a formidable shield of Mustangs executing daring maneuvers. In the late summer of 1944, during a mission over the Ruhr industrial region, squadrons employing inverted dives and low-level approaches disrupted enemy formations with devastating efficiency. German pilots, expecting conventional intercepts, found themselves caught off guard. Enemy fighters crashed or disengaged in confusion, and bombers reached their targets with significantly fewer losses. Major James Halsey and his comrades had proven that tactical creativity could convert innovation into survival, and survival into decisive advantage. These successes did not come without cost. Mistakes were frequent, sometimes fatal. Inexperience and overconfidence led to mid-air collisions and misjudged dives, costing pilots their lives even as they attempted to perfect maneuvers. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Riley, a promising young pilot, was lost during a low-level inverted run over the Ardennes, his Mustang disintegrating under the strain of excessive speed and G-forces. Each loss was a sobering reminder that the line between genius and recklessness in the air was thin, and that mastery required not just courage but meticulous skill and discipline. Despite the risks, the lessons were invaluable. Commanders began to integrate these maneuvers into broader tactical doctrine. Instructors emphasized situational awareness, timing, and precision, teaching pilots when to improvise and when to adhere to structured plans. The Mustang's versatility allowed for rapid adaptation. High-altitude dives, inverted attacks, sudden climbs, and synchronized group maneuvers became part of the playbook. The combination of aircraft performance and human ingenuity reshaped the very concept of air superiority. German intelligence, through captured pilots and reconnaissance, noted these changes with alarm. Reports described the seemingly unnatural handling of the Mustang and the unpredictability of American tactics, concluding that conventional strategies would no longer suffice. The impact on the Luftwaffe was profound. Experienced pilots admitted that they had underestimated the Americans, believing them reliant on numbers and rigid formations. Encounters with Mustangs employing innovative maneuvers forced German aces to rethink their approach. A captured Mustang, flown in a controlled test, revealed handling characteristics that left even veteran Luftwaffe pilots astonished. Rolls, inverted dives, and rapid reversals executed with apparent ease. Tactical manuals were revised and training adjusted. But the psychological edge had shifted irrevocably. The Americans were no longer merely fighting. They were innovating in real time, turning each engagement into a test of adaptability. These victories extended beyond tactical achievements. Morale soared among American squadrons, invigorating pilots who had faced months of relentless attrition. The knowledge that innovation could turn the tide gave rise to boldness and initiative, qualities that would become hallmarks of successful Allied air operations. At the same time, the German forces, constrained by doctrine and mechanical limitations, struggled to adapt quickly. The Mustang had become both a physical and psychological weapon, an aircraft whose presence alone could unsettle opponents and force reconsideration of established strategies. Yet, for all its successes, the story was not without caution. Each maneuver demanded respect for the aircraft and the human limits of its pilots. Structural stress, high G-forces, and split-second timing meant that even a minor miscalculation could be catastrophic. The very techniques that provided advantage could just as easily result in tragedy, a duality that underscored the thin line between brilliance and disaster in aerial warfare. In retrospect, the adoption of these new tactics marked a turning point in World War II aviation. The Mustang, coupled with innovative pilots willing to challenge convention, enabled the Allies to dominate contested skies, protect bombers, and achieve objectives previously deemed too costly or impossible. Enemy formations were disrupted, morale shifted, and the balance of air power increasingly favored those who dared to fly beyond expectation. Every successful sortie, every hard-won engagement, reinforced a singular truth. In the war of the skies, creativity and courage were as decisive as firepower. And from this crucible of innovation, a legacy was born, one that would shape air combat for generations to come. The war eventually moved on, but the echoes of those daring flights lingered far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The upside-down dives, the daring low-level attacks, the improvisations born of desperation, they were more than tactical maneuvers. They were proof that innovation under pressure could change the course of events. Pilots who had once been bound by doctrine found that audacity, skill, and intuition could redefine the very rules of aerial warfare. The Mustang had not only survived the crucible of combat, it had become a symbol of ingenuity and courage. For the men who dared to push the limits, the consequences were as profound as the victories. Lieutenant James Halsey, whose name became synonymous with the first successful inverted dives, survived the war, but carried with him the scars of witnessing comrades fall. Major George Preddy, a master of precision attacks, would go down in combat, remembered for bravery, that inspired a generation of pilots. Engineers and tacticians, often invisible to the public eye, saw their theories tested in fire and sky, proving that innovation was as much a product of human courage as of mechanical design. Their combined efforts transformed the Mustang from a promising aircraft into a legend of the air. The Luftwaffe, too, learned lessons that no manual could fully convey. Captured Mustangs and reports from test pilots revealed handling and performance that were almost otherworldly. German pilots admitted, sometimes with reluctant admiration, that they had never seen an aircraft respond with such precision and versatility. The knowledge that the enemy had mastered tactics they themselves had conceived in theory created both fear and respect. The skies, once a domain of rigid expectation, had become a theater of imagination and adaptation. The war had taught that victory often favored those willing to embrace the unknown. Beyond strategy and survival, the legacy of these flights carried a philosophical weight. Each maneuver, each calculated risk, was a statement about human ingenuity in the face of adversity. The pilot's courage reminded the world that progress, whether in warfare, technology, or thought, demands not only intelligence, but the willingness to act despite fear. In the cramped cockpit of a Mustang, twisting inverted under enemy fire, one could glimpse the fragile intersection of skill, intuition, and audacity, where history is made. The small, defiant acts of individuals could ripple outward, altering the course of conflicts and leaving marks that endure long after the battles are over. In retrospect, the Mustang and the pilots who mastered it left a dual legacy. They demonstrated that technology could expand human capability in extraordinary ways, and that innovation was inseparable from the courage to test its limits. But they also reminded future generations that every advantage carries risk, and that the line between genius and catastrophe is perilously thin. These lessons would echo in post-war aviation, influencing designs, tactics, and doctrines for decades to come. Air combat had been forever changed, not only by the aircraft, but by the boldness of those who refused to accept the limits of conventional thinking. And so the story concludes not with a victory or a defeat, but with reflection. In the sky over Europe, where clouds had once concealed fear and uncertainty, pilots found freedom in mastery and creativity. The Mustang, a captured aircraft flown by astonished enemies, became a testament to what is possible when courage meets innovation. Every inverted dive, every maneuver that seemed impossible, carried a deeper truth: that progress and survival alike belong to those who dare, and that the price of audacity, though high, can leave a legacy that resonates through history. As the engines quieted and the war drew to a close, one thought remained. In the infinite expanse above the battlefield, it was not the strongest or the fastest alone who triumphed, but those willing to challenge gravity itself, to turn the sky upside down, and in doing so, to change the world forever.